start by reading or saying a karakia, which was gifted to the Bird Academy, and it's based on our Māori name for the Bird Academy Trust, which is Ha'imano. And the karakia is whakarongo, whakarongo, whakarongo ki ngā ha'imano e karanga nai, tui, tui, tuia. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki waho, tuia ki roto, tuia tihiri ngā tangata katoa, ti he uri uri, ti he nako nako, ti he Māori ora. And a translation or a retelling of that is listen, listen, listen to the many voices that are calling. So bind, weave, bind from above, bind from below, bind from without and bind to self, weave the bonds of the people, carry our descendants, let them adorn us. It is the breath of life. And this echoes on our mission, our vision within the Bird Academy to make sure the voices of disabled people are truly and meaningfully represented in research, included in research, and that disabled people are able to contribute to not only what research, not only the research itself as participants, but what research is done and what new knowledge is produced. So today I'm speaking with my other hat on as a University of Otago staff member, and Philippa is not from the Bird Academy, but we wanted to highlight a topic that comes through again and again and again in our conversations with disabled people about how we as healthcare professionals might engage with and have conversations around that support both risk and autonomy, and what it might mean to speak up to support the needs of people who experience disability as well. So Philippa is going to start by talking about her PhD project, and then I'll follow by a research project that I'm involved with within the University of Otago Rehabilitation, Teaching and Research Unit. Philippa is, I'm really fortunate to be able to be one of her co-supervisors along with Suzanne, who's here today as well. And I'll let Philippa tell you more about her research, but it's her PhD has been done through the University of Auckland. So Philippa, would you like to share? And I'll let you go. So 20 minutes from Philippa, 20 minutes from myself, and then we've got about 20 minutes of discussion. So I'm really hoping that you've finished your lunch by then and you want to turn on your cameras and have a good chat.
Oh, kia ora, Rachelle, thank you. And tēnā koutou katoa. It's lovely to be virtually with you all today. I feel I've already made some connections chatting earlier before with Alex, who stems from my hometown, Namutu, New Plymouth. And I also did my undergraduate studies as a speech language therapist at in Ōtautahi, University of Canterbury as well. And so I'm speaking to you from West Auckland, Titirangi today on 4 years of work so far. So I'm in my 4th year of my PhD part-time at the University of Auckland. And knee deep in analysis at the moment. I've got 1.5 years to go. And so I'm really at the point of stopping, taking a bit of a pause, coming up for a breath and just checking out a couple of ruminations I have at the moment and with my supervisory group around this concept of how new graduates in allied health think about speaking up. So be really keen to hear your thoughts on this as we go. I've got a couple of QR codes that will lead you to a couple of publications. So I'll be putting these up as we speak. So if anyone's interested, have your phone ready so you can do that old thing called scanning. If you just go on to take a photo and put it across the code and then click the center, that'll take you to the PDF of the papers. So let's start with just a way of describing the study, really, what I'll be going through with you today. Laurelie Lingard's work, I really like her writing. So she described a way of writing and thinking and speaking about your research and what's called a problem gap hook concept. And so the problem being what am I adding to the conversation with my study here? What's going on? What's the problem? And that's the reason for the study. What's the gap in the literature? And what is it that I'm hoping to contribute to this academic conversation on speaking up? And so what we know so far is that speaking up is critical. So for graduates in healthcare to be able to say, hey, I've got an idea, or hey, I've made a mistake, or oh, I think you've made a mistake. It's critical for patient safety. It's critical for quality improvement, moving things forward. And also new graduates have better job satisfaction, better teamwork. So it is important. A study conducted looking at the reports that went through the Health and Disability Commission. They took a snapshot of 100 reports and found that 90% of them identified communication issues within the team as being a key contributor to patient safety issues. So it's really important. I'll introduce you briefly to a scoping review that we conducted on this topic, and surprise, surprise, we found that we don't actually know a lot about how the new graduate workforce in the area of allied health experience speaking up. So good, there's a gap, which hopefully I'll be able to fill with the work that we're doing. And I'll be introducing you that the study we've broken up into 2 phases. So phase 1 were a series of focus groups that we've written up, and phase 2 is a longitudinal study that I'm 2 interviews away from completing. Another way of thinking about the study is using some questions here. So the overarching question is looking at what are the experiences of new grads in allied health speaking up in healthcare, and then drilling down a bit more, how do they experience communicating, what's motivating them or influencing them. And I mentioned before, I'm taking a longitudinal focus with phase 2. So I've had the privilege of working, interviewing new graduates for a year, and they're all still there, which is wonderful. So how does this change over time? Because if they're speaking up well and they stay speaking up well, or they progress without anything being done, well, we're not needing to be looking at it. So does this change over time? How does this change over time? And just another way of mapping out the study, I'm thinking from a realist perspective, so it's a research paradigm. The methodologies being used, so we've got the case studies, the focus groups, and the longitudinal part of the study, and the analysis using with the semi-structured interviews using reflexive thematic analysis, and a particular way of analysing data in a realist methodology using what's called context mechanism outcome configuration. So just a neat term to describe having a bit of a fun play around with data. And Alex will recognise the beautiful manga there. I'm just, if you're distracted by the photos, it's fine. I've got some beautiful shots there of my hometown, New Plymouth, as we go. But just a couple of definitions here. Voice, behaviour and speaking up tend to come up similarly in the literature, and that's what's described as a change-orientated communicative behaviour. So it's where someone is wanting to make some positive change by literally speaking up, or it might be that they're doing this in written form. So for this study, we've been using the term speaking up. The workforce I'm looking at a new graduate, so we've described these as being those in their first 2 years of work, and allied health, so that's the workforce that's not nursing or medicine. And so before jumping into the focus groups, we conducted the scoping review, looking at what the scope of study of voice behaviour in healthcare setting. And you'll see here, this was published in 2021 in the Journal of Allied Health. And if your eyesight is better than mine, you can squint down to the conclusion. So originally we had, I think, 194 articles that came up. Thank goodness I didn't have to critique all of those. And we distilled it down to 76 papers that we looked at between 2009 and 2019. And as we expected, we found that there is global interest in this topic. It's growing, and most of the publications are within nursing and medicine. So very little about allied health. Pharmacies mentioned, but some respiratory physiologists were mentioned, but not a lot about other areas in allied health, and no papers published about new graduates in allied health. So we continued and moved into phase 1 of the study. So that was we did a series of focus groups, and this was right in the middle of, I can't remember which lockdown we were in, but up in Auckland, it was quite tricky actually. I had some wonderful participants who were very, very generous with their time, yet with sickness or having to cover staff leave, it meant that many who had signed up couldn't come in the end. So we did another round of focus groups. So in the end, we conducted 2 different focus groups of new graduates in allied health and 2 different focus groups with supervisors of new graduates in allied health, asking them these types of questions here. And so the new graduate focus group was written up and published here in the Internet Journal of Allied Health Sciences and Practice. A chocolate fish, or a virtual chocolate fish for anyone who can spot the typo there. This paper was written up more in a thematic analysis type style with a thematic framework. And if I dwell on the slide, you can put your phone up and capture the paper to have a bit more of a look at that in detail. And then the second paper was the supervisors, asking them their experiences of new graduates, the observations of new graduates speaking up. And this one was also published within the same paper, same journal, I should say. This paper, I took more of a realist perspective, and you'll see in the abstract there, it describes writing up initial program theories. So working with the new graduates, we created a program theory from their data, which was then added to more from the supervisors. So I'll show you that in a minute, but I'll just pause on that slide if you want to capture that paper there. So in total, we had 7 new graduates join us and 7 supervisors from a range of different professional groups, all within the Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland area of, so they'd come from a number of different Te Whatu order up in Auckland. And so I just pulled for your interest just a bit of a similarity differences focus here when looking across between the new graduates and the supervisors. So there were some similarities in the speaking up topics. They were talking about speaking up about patient advocacy. So the new graduates sharing what they thought, having conversations with the patient and sharing that with the team, patient safety as well. And burnout came up as a topic which they would speak up about as well. Concern about their own risk of burnout, but also that of their teams. They had similarities within the speaking up strategies that they were talking about, and the protective aspects of supervision. So supervision came up in this study as something which was quite protective to support these new grads to speak up. So they were using their supervision in a way so that they could rehearse what they were going to say at the next team meeting, for example. And this was something quite new. This hadn't appeared in the other literature on speaking up. They all talked about a need for training. None of them had training in this space, and a need for team systems to change to better enable new grads to speak up about patient safety. Some differences there. So the new grads talked more about speaking up for themselves, so advocating for themselves and advocating for the team. And the supervisors were talking more about speaking up around cultural inequities and racism, either towards patients or towards other team members. So I'll move on now. This was the program theory, which is a realist way of thinking about what's going on and why. And so you map out these statements. If these features are in place, the new grads will feel a particular way, which will motivate them to then complete these actions. So this is a typical way of looking at data from a realist perspective. So we mapped out this program theory based on the new grads data, and then added to it in the next slide in blue here. So this is what the supervisors added to that story about why and how new grads speak up. And so you can see there the blue text is really drilling down a bit more into supervision and what's happening within supervision to enable the new grads to speak up. So these two program theories you'll find in those two papers I linked you through to. What I'd really love to share with you now is some developing thoughts from phase 2. So phase 2 is a 1-year-long study. I've got 10 new graduates in allied health that I've had the privilege of meeting at 3 time points across the year and interviewing and asking them about speaking up and really talking together and growing our thinking collectively around how they speak up, why, what works, what doesn't work. And so what we're finding through these interviews is that there are features of what we call context that are enabling the new grads to feel driven or influenced to speak up. And that for many, this is happening well. For some, however, it's not. And that might be that they are feeling the need that they want to speak up, but for whatever reasons related to the setting that they're in and some influences at play, they are not. So they're what's called withholding voice. So they're thinking, oh, that's something I should speak up about. That's poor practice, or I've made a mistake. But for whatever reason, they're not doing that. And in some cases, the new graduates are speaking up, but they may be doing that ineffectively, or they are speaking up, but their intended expectations of that isn't happening. So they've got unmet expectations. This is a bit of a, I'll walk you through this. So I'm thinking about traffic lights here. So again, this is some navel gazing, we could say, but there is some background to it, looking at the new grads that I've been working with. And when we talk about their thinking about whether to speak up or not, there are these variables at play. So if we think about the y-axis, there's high risk to patient at the top and low risk to the patient down the bottom. And then the x-axis, you've got high risk to the team relationship or their own reputation versus low risk. And so talking to these new grads, they tend to be, so let's look at the green box, they tend to be quite clear when there's high risk to the patient, that's really clear, but low risk to the team if they are to speak up. So an example would be, one of the grads was talking about a patient that they'd been asked to go and help get up out of the chair and mobilise and to do some walking down the corridor. But that new grad had gone and taken some observations and some data and found that the person was not well enough to be supported to be walked that day. So that was quite clear, and they could say, actually, no, I can't do that today. And then you've got in the red box there where there's high risk to the team relationship. So if the new grad speaks up, this is potentially going to risk their relationship with their team, but low risk to the patient. So an example there would be where, I'll just check that one actually. Oh, yes. So the example there might be where there is some team relationship issues, and in some cases, new grads were talking about experiences of bullying or racism towards themselves. So there's no direct impact on the patient safety, but an impact on themselves. And so in those situations, they're choosing not to speak up, and they were quite clear about that it was deemed too high risk to their team relationship and themselves. They didn't. And then we've got the two amber boxes, and I've kept those as orange. It's boxes where these new grads are needing to spend a bit more time to process this thinking up about whether they're going to speak up. And this is where you might have a situation when there's high risk to the patient and also high risk to the team. So an example there would be around where a new graduate may well have observed another team member using incorrect moving and handling techniques. And so they're needing to really process through, okay, so if I say something that's going to jeopardize my relationship with the team, but also there's a high risk to the patient with these poor techniques being used. And what we're finding that in these situations, what motivates these new grads to speak up then are these factors here. So that you can see there that reflective supervision style coming in to give the new grads time to rehearse what they're going to say and to check with others, is this what, is there another way I could say this? Is it sounding like it's right? They're getting some practice. A lot of them talked about meetings where there was time in the meetings to allow everyone to give their message, and they were asked what their opinion was, rather than meetings that were quite rushed. A lot of them talked about observing others speaking up well, and that was something that motivated them and gave them some direction. And a lot of the new grads are talking about working together interprofessionally with other team members, then supports that relationship. They get to know each other better. They get there's higher trust in that relationship, and that's motivating them to feel that they can speak up more easily. And then if we look down into the bottom right-hand box, so this is where we've got low risk to the team relationship and to themselves, and low risk to the patient. And these are the quality improvement ideas. So some of the new grads talked about suggesting ideas for professional development for the team, or one of them spoke about really wanting to suggest a kitchen cleaning roster. And so what these grads are finding, that with these features in place, they can then speak up about these factors. So if they've got time, so time in their week to prioritize these speaking up situations, if they're quite clear that, yes, this is part of your role, we also want to hear you giving us suggestions about better working practices. And we're expecting, as a team, we expect to hear these ideas. So if there's those expectations, they feel more driven. If there's something that tunes into their own values, and some of the grads were actually personally and professionally working on, they called it being more assertive. That was sometimes the wording that they used. and that they can then speak up. So this is just some early ruminations on how we think these graduates are thinking through contributing to those risky conversations. And we can also, so we're learning from the things that are working well, and working out what factors we need to put into play there to enable all new graduates to be speaking up well. I think probably, what do you think, Rachelle? Should we pause there? Is that a good time?
Yeah, that's probably a great place to pause. I'm really keen to hear
nice.
your thoughts about what we do about that red box as well.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but
great. I'll
maybe if I do
share.
the next presentation, and then pop any questions that you might have, emerging thoughts, questions, missed perspectives in the chat, and we will follow them up at the end of the session. In the meantime, I'll get started on the one that I'm going to be talking about. I'm just trying to set everything up. Is that stage sharing? Yes, it has. And I'm just trying to make sure I can see everyone. So as I mentioned, this is a research project that I'm involved with wearing my University of Otago hat. It's actually being led by Dr. Paul Skirrow, who's a psychologist working in psychological medicine, and Professor Jean Hay-Smith, myself, have been supporting the work as well, along with the support of Anna Hogman in a research fellow capacity. So just to say also that this is the start of a series of projects, so it's kind of a starting conversation. And I also just want to define what we mean by rehabilitation. So it's very complex to define rehabilitation, but I want to reassure people that we're thinking about how to support people who experience impairments and or live with the experience of disability to live well. All right, that may not be just about acute rehabilitation to get people back to a certain level of functioning. It may also involve supporting people to live well within the context of their lives. So we've got that very broad biopsychosocial view of rehabilitation when we're using that term. So we'll just to go through that. Right, I'll see if I can move it on. So essentially, the ability to make choices about our lives, determine our direction, and make our own mistakes really is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And the concept of self-determination or mana motohaki, tēnā rangatiratanga, they've been really central to the lives of New Zealanders for a long time, and are now enshrined within the Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But, similar explicit concepts of self-determination or autonomy have been around since the writings of the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, within Western thinking anyway. In rehabilitation services, the concept of self-determination is especially pertinent. And we can see here I've listed a series of theoretical approaches, conventions, strategies, and principles and approaches that have reinforced our need to be thinking about self-determination within the way we deliver services. And there's this explicit expectation that we should be increasingly seeking to enable and empower people. I'm going to call them interchangeably patients, disabled people, tangata whaikaha Māori, both as receivers of rehabilitation services. So it's expected that we'll increasingly seek to enable or empower rather than to make decisions on the behalf of disabled people. And as the whakatauki on this slide suggests, one of the roles of rehabilitation clinicians is to provide patients or disabled people with appropriate tools to support and achieve their full potential, their full ability to live the life that they desire, to flourish well. Mā te huruhuru ka rere te manu, adorn the bird with feathers so it can fly. So just a little bit of background into this, where this question came from, really. Essentially, decision-making and how we support people to contribute to decision-making and how decisions are made has really been mainly conceptualized around balancing ethical issues. But basically, recently, there's been increasing argument that that it's too simplistic. In that it doesn't really take into account these sort of complex organizational and social issues. And so this particular study was really starting to explore what it means for how we can support enablement, support self-determination in the way that decision-making, and particularly decision-making around risk, is managed. So I'll go into, because the findings from this study are not complete yet. I'm really going to be focusing on why we're asking the question, some of the ideas that are framing that question, the question that we're asking, giving you some idea about who's contributed, and then just some questions that are coming out of it, but you also get some takeaways, because it's nothing worse than going to presentation and then going, but we don't know yet. You have to come back and see. So I've got some takeaways as well. So alongside the concept of self-determination, there's been this equally strong moral imperative for those with power to offer protection or do good, beneficence, or to do no harm, non-maleficence, for those who consider themselves responsible. And certainly there's been the Hippocratic oath that you've probably heard. But essentially the key tension really is there's this desire to avoid harm versus this need to support an individual's ability to determine their own futures. And that's kind of this classic conflict. And it's certainly fundamental to many of the decision-making tensions that we might experience within our professional practice. In rehab services, clinicians' decision-making in relation to client care has traditionally been about balancing these things. And I guess today I just want to start by questioning some of those assumptions, at least to start with, as we move forward. Specifically, some of the discomforts that just to sort of whet the appetite, so to speak, some of the discomfort that there can be for us is we're committed to promoting well-being, protecting patients from harm, supporting choices. Clinicians particularly are also, though, responsible to professional bodies, to professional standards. We're also aware of often what the organisation demands of us. And we're often also aware of how a person's choices may impact others. And what's our responsibility to others in the face of a choice that we're concerned about. The other issue, of course, is I'm sure many of you have been in this situation where we might feel like we're guided in a certain way within our professional roles and what's expected of us, but that might be in conflict or in tension with our own personal feelings and values. And that can lead to sort of an internal sense of discombobulation, maybe. How do we make sense of that? How do we manage that? And I'm sure all of these issues are the things that new graduates are trying to develop skills in as they go. So just some ponderings and wondering that have kind of gone into this topic as we framed up the study is that these ethical principles, they tend to work quite well for a moment in time or discrete decisions. You can kind of balance them out and make a choice for this, in this moment, this particular situation. And so they've tended to be used more for that. And as I mentioned, this risk to self and risk to others has come into it. The other thing is there's been a move towards what's called relational ethics. And so the medical ethical principles tend to be more individualistic in their focus, more about an individual making a choice or people making choices for an individual. Whereas relational ethics is, or relational autonomy, it really foregrounds relationships and interdependence. And I'm going to read some bits here just to make sure I'm accurately representing some key concepts. So respecting relational autonomy isn't just refraining from interfering with a person's ability to act, but it's also in their own best interests. It's also about seeking opportunities, looking for ways to uphold or support or to expand the person's ability to make choices. So it's not a static, this is where this person's at, therefore this is what we'll do in all circumstances, but it's a dynamic relationship, built on relationship of looking to explore how to uphold, support and expand a person's decision-making capacities. And so obviously communication and collaboration is really important, and it's an action ethic rather than the outcome is the decider. It is the process by which the ethics are enacted over time that's really important. So that's just a bit of basics. Then we come into what is the aim of rehabilitation. And once again, I've got that really broad view of what does it mean to support people to live well and to flourish. And, you know, there's essentially, we're trying to support people to we're trying to promote functional independence. We're trying to support social reintegration, participation. We're trying to develop compensatory capabilities or in response to the consequences of injury, disease, and illness. We're looking for the person's trying to, might be attempting new skills or looking at new ways to enact really meaningful values for them, pushing the boundaries. It always involves risk, right? Rehabilitation is essentially a bit of a risky process for the person who's undergoing it, yeah? So it is it's a process of learning. It's a process of trying new ways of being or new ways of doing. And so that is just to keep that in mind as we move forward. The other thing I just want to challenge is what are the risks within rehabilitation? And when we're having discussions about rights, risks, those sorts of things, we're often quite clear about the risk of not doing something or the risk of certain behaviours. So we might be quite concerned about dysphagic patients who would prefer not to use a modified diet. Or we might be really concerned about people who are not following, waiting for assistance to go to a toilet, for instance, when concerned that they're going to fall, or driving the wheelchairs recklessly. I remember that was always a good thing, and scooters outdoors in the community. Who are they going to harm? All those sorts of issues. And then there's things like unsafe discharge plans. And so there's risks that we kind of recognise and know, all right? I just want to challenge you to one risk that we often don't prioritise and that we don't necessarily even recognise. And that is the risk of failure or discouragement, of shame, of disempowerment. And if people feel disempowered within a process, it is a massive risk for them within the process that we need to take into account. And this was like a aha moment from me when I heard this quote. And this was a healthcare professional talking about or reflecting on not allowing a person to walk independently to the toilet. It's a culture, like you say, it's perhaps against a lot of therapists' belief and conflicting with the keep people safe mentality. I think it's something we need to question as clinicians in general, though. So how far we take that as controlling people, because we think we're keeping them safe, but how much are we taking away their choice and their freedom? And it's so horrible. Someone who could potentially be continent and get to the toilet, have an accident, you know, it's quite humiliating. So it's just recognising the impact that can have. It's perhaps not talked about as much as how degrading a fall is. So people are often emphasising the risk of falling, but what is the risk of incontinence, of being in a bed, unable to move for yourself? And what's the impact of disempowerment within the process of rehabilitation when people aren't able to enact their choices? So that's just to throw that in there in terms of challenging some of the ways we frame these risky conversations. I guess my key thing I'd like to say is the way we manage situations, risky situations, can make a real big difference to outcomes, to the experience of the service, obviously, but also to outcomes. This is a process of supporting people to learn. And so if we look at some of these buzzwords, keywords, relational autonomy, person-centered approaches, self-identity development, learning to live well, you know, it's about questioning some of these things and re-evaluating them. A patient's capacity for decision-making may be permanently or temporarily damaged or underdeveloped or diminished or fluctuating, but it's not a static situation, and it's certainly not an either-or situation. Just because someone may not have capacity in one particular area does not mean they do not have the ability to make choice and have choice and control in other areas. And we often have this black and white on-off sort of switch within rehabilitation services. Patients in rehabilitation, they're grappling with personal identity often. Often they're trying to reconstruct a sense of self, and they've experienced this crisis of health, and they're trying to assess, how does my new life look like, and against the values that are important to me. Often people say, well, this person's inconsistent. They don't consistently tell me exactly the same thing, so I can't trust them to make a good decision. Well, hello, I change my mind quite a lot depending on how I wake up each day. And it's also part of that development of, coping and adjustment and adapting to a change in life's circumstances. It's quite normal for fluidity and a dynamic sort of aspect around these issues. All right. So, so that's just some basics. So essentially, when we looked at the evidence, there's basically very Western understandings of how to handle risky conversations. They tend to be considered in rehabilitation as well as sort of discrete events or decision points, rather than specifically how our actions and the processes that we use can support self-determination within decision making. And certainly there was nothing that was sort of had been done within the New Zealand context with its specific unique health and disability service, cultural, legal and political context. So to start with, we decided to explore clinicians' experiences. Our intention is not to stop there. This is just the first start. And we used a qualitative method called grounded theory to explore how rehabilitation clinicians are currently involved with contributing to facilitating decision-making in real life context. And we did that mainly, well, we did it all through interviews. We wanted to talk to rehabilitation clinicians, and we essentially used the HPCA and the social worker registration legislation as our kind of, if you fit under these, that fits. We thought it would be useful for people to have at least 5 years experience, and obviously working within New Zealand, but also within the adult population, just to make it a little bit a more clear-cut question to start with. But we were looking to talk with rehabilitation clinicians working in a range of contexts. So acute services, so a new health condition, what does it look like with that, where there may be some reduced capacity initially, say in an acute brain injury or something like that, but that we saw that changing. An outpatient context where someone is coming to a hospital for some ongoing rehabilitation input, so it's a clinic setting. Community-based rehab, which is going to a person's home, and services that actually were sort of support people to live well over time, and that's So we didn't get as many as we wanted for that, and that's an area we'd like to expand more. But we did interview 14, Anna interviewed 14 people. As you can see, physios seem to be quite good at signing up for things, don't they? But we've also worked hard and got some rehabilitation physicians and psychologists, occupational therapists, and a social worker. And you can kind of see, as I mentioned, that those working in a long-term support sort of it's not residential care, but it was a group-based home, and for people that required higher levels of support for their day-to-day functioning and living well, right through to, yeah, as you can see, more in the inpatient setting. All of them were working in neurological or older person health services. We didn't specifically specify that, but they seem to be the ones that were keener to talk about this. These are some of the questions that we asked them. And so we tried to keep the words quite generic to see how people were even framing it and talking about it. And so part of our question was how are clinicians thinking about these issues? What is it what is it that they're bringing to the table, I guess, in terms of their own expectations of what they might need to consider. As I said, there's no findings as yet, but I just want to highlight there's kind of a spectrum in terms of patient autonomy. There's a recognition that people will require different levels of support, particularly in acute settings and in other particular settings, and that seems to be really make a difference. The other thing is clinicians think that their appraisals are really, really important. What they bring to the decision making is really important, but they highly value the therapeutic relationship with the patient as part of that. But they are really influenced by the organisations they work in. Which, if I ask some questions. Who decides a person's capacity and how is that decided, and is it a one-off discrete decision, or is it is each person allowed to also have their own spectrum for different aspects? How is that worked out? And then of course we've talked about who can actually speak up, who is allowed to speak up, and how are people supported to speak up, to advocate for the person's voice in decision making. Interestingly, very, very, very scant references to family being involved in decision making at all from the clinicians that we interviewed. The other thing that sort of came through really interestingly, this is just to whet your appetite to read more or see more when it comes out. But there was where clinicians are working seems to be really important. So for instance, those who are working in the community seem to feel more able to act in ways that supported decision-making and patient choice. They seem to find that much easier than those working in inpatient settings, which is interesting. And interestingly, therapeutic relationships seem to be impacted both positively and negatively. So rehab providers talked about the value of being in someone's home and being able to understand their cultural and personal values, but actually was also quite tricky because you often had to, manage the expectations of family, and that added complexity to the whole thing. And so there was that tension of actually it's kind of harder when you know the whole context of a person. Even though it's a good thing, it actually makes my job harder. And so that's just an interesting sort of wonder what, and I don't know where we'll go with the findings. So these are just sort of my off the top of my head wonderings. So yeah, watch this space in terms of findings from the space. Certainly we're really keen to interview and hear from people who are receiving rehabilitation services across all of those contexts, because I know that they, based on previous work, they'll have had quite a different perspectives on what's actually happening within service provision. And certainly it would be really interesting to hear the perspectives of family of whānau. I did mention, I want to just bring us back to let's continue to find ways to actually try and and support people into having self-determination and mana motuhake within the way that we provide services. Let's continue to try and adorn the feathers, adorn the bird with feathers. Some takeaways, like I said, awful when you, and this, I'll send, the PowerPoint will go up on our website so you can see it, but just to show you through, this is sort of some key points that have come from the previous literature that you might want to think about, which is kind of highlighting some key points. From a few of the papers, there's some really useful sort of recommendations and frameworks for perhaps having these conversations within your team. So if this is something that you would like to follow up, then you might want to have a look at some of these papers in terms of some different ways that you might start to have conversations. This one is around when patient choices entail risks for others, for instance. What are some prompt questions that can stimulate reflection and deliberation? And this one is providing support for decision-making to adults with intellectual disability. But I'm pretty sure we'll have some things that we will be able to, some support practical strategies that we would find useful in the own settings that we're working in. And that's just a list of some of the papers that I've been talking about. And if you're having trouble accessing them, just email me on my Otago email and I can help you access those. That's no issue. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm just wondering, it'd be really great in the few minutes we've got left, sorry, we're never enough time. But has anyone got anything they would like to, I see there's things in the chat, but I'm going to start by opening up to, is there anyone that would like to say anything?
I was just thinking about the difference between trust and safety, and when you were talking about the people feeling okay to speak up, in your thing, it's really important to know that people need trust rather than safety to be vulnerable. And trust is quite different than safety. So, and just want to say, I put Brene Brown in the chat because she does some great work on shame. And I know that for me, at least, with disabled friends, we often sit down and talk about those awful times where you wet your pants or done, something like that has happened. And it seems that shame culture is different for disabled people than it's for clinicians. And they're often clinicians are projecting their own shame onto clients rather than just saying, well, if you poo your pants, doesn't really matter, and that is again a cultural thing of having an environment where it doesn't matter. It's like, oh well, we're all people, everyone can't be pants at some point. Yeah, so, and good to see that you'll be looking at the experiences of disabled people and partner and seeing what difference there is.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I think it's a really great point about that shame aspect. And I've done some work around incontinence and supporting people to improve continence. And I hear all the time from healthcare professionals, people don't want to talk about continence. And I hear from the people who are experiencing continence, I really wish I could talk about it. I'm trying to talk about it, but I get shut down.
Yep.
Thanks, Pat. The that concept of trust and team culture is, like you said, so critical. The new grads were talking a lot about leaders that they connected with, and they're people who talk about the mistakes that they've made and show vulnerability, and they felt a real connection with them. So yeah, you're right on with those comments. Thank you.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
There's a really good TED talk called On Being Wrong, and what points out is that being wrong feels like being right.
Yeah.
You realise that you're wrong.
Thank you. Now, I notice people are heading away if they need to, and you're very, very welcome, but we're also, because we don't have to clear the room or anything, if anyone wants to stay and have a chat for a few minutes, you're very, very welcome. So yeah, let's do feel free to go, and hugely grateful for those who have come, but also if people need to go, you're very welcome. Anything else from anyone? Julianne. Oh, we can't hear you, Julianne. You might have your volume down because you're unmuted. Yeah, no, we can't hear you. While Julianne's sorting that, you put it in the chat.
Put in the chat.
Anything?
Rachelle, Susanna just mentioned in one of the comments around a time where perhaps new grads have spoken up but not expecting change. One of the examples, one of the wards with communicating, so to talk about people on the ward, they would talk about them by the room number. And this graduate found that that was awful and dehumanizing. And so the new grad didn't feel that they had power or autonomy to say this isn't right, but instead would call the person by their name and then give their room number. So it was kind of straddling both ways. So I think that's just an example I came up with. Yeah.
I think one of the things that was very, as one of your co-supervisors, one of the sobering things for me, Philippa, was the proportion or a small number of new graduates that stopped speaking up over time.
Yes.
That learned over time that their risk to themselves and their team relationships weren't worth it.
And we haven't, I'm not seeing new grads who are speaking up where that's improved over time. They're either staying the same or dropping off. Yeah, which is sobering for sure.
I'm interested, I know Vanessa and Maria and Liz are involved in clinical setting. Is that something that you've seen in the clinical area? Right.
Sorry.
Maria. Hi, Maria.
Yes, we do. Definitely see people identified by ethnicity and things like that, and it goes both ways. So we're trying to, using people's proper names, etc. But yeah, that does happen. The other thing I was going to say was I just recently done a presentation on falls. So from an organisational perspective, falls are considered an incident. So Swan had 10 falls last week. But my presentation was partly to address the fact that falls is a healthy part of rehab. People are learning new skills and practicing to be independent. And I mean, without disability, we all have falls, don't we? Trip, do things like that. So
yeah.
And I had pulled up some research, just say in Canada, they separate out the falls that are falls because someone had the bed too high or something like that. But then there's the mobility falls where people are actually just practicing to mobilise in a different way or post their illness or disability. So it's interesting the language we use because the falls aren't a bad thing necessarily. They're part of growing and learning new skills. So yeah, it was a Canadian research that I had referred to. And patients do learn to, they're using their self-determination and autonomy, and we teach perhaps the best way to mobilise based on what we know, but they still will want to explore their limitations, understand their own they want, just understand what they can and can't do, and they want to be able to practice that and
Mm.
not feel shameful because, oops, I had a fall, I need assistance to get off the floor again, because it's all just part of rehab.
Yeah, no, that's great. Maria works in a spinal injury rehab setting. So, you know, these are, I
Thanks,
certainly,
everyone.
when I was learning to ski, I was told if I didn't fall every run, I wasn't pushing myself enough. So it's a different way of framing, acceptable risk, really, isn't it, and choice making. Julian, really interesting to map the two presentations onto each other, considering new graduates as people constructing a new professional identity. Absolutely. And I think it's I was seeing a lot of sort of overlapping ideas and obviously they're two different studies, but I think it's a really interesting area to explore, and one that actually makes a difference to how people, like we have lots of rhetoric around ensuring choice and control and autonomy and self-determination, but how is that actually enacted in the way we do things? And we really need to challenge some of our notions about whether we actually do it or not, I think. I don't know, Pippa, if you've got anything to add to that?
Well, I think there's just different value systems around that. And that we often look at trying to restore function rather than trying to restore value. So if somebody can't do something anymore, what can they do instead to create a similar value base for them?
That's fantastic. What a wonderful way to end. So thank you. We're a lovely little team to finish. I am going to finish with a karakia. I'm just going to find it because it's not right in front of me.
Thanks, Julian.
Kia tau, kia tātu katoa, te atawhai o te tātu ariki, ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi nā tahitanga ki te waiairua tapu, aki, amene. Thank you so much, everyone, and it's been lovely to be together and to share this conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.